Hey there. If you're new to FHIR, you might be a little confused with how FHIR is exactly used in practice. Now, there are a lot of ways in which people use FHIR. And in this video, we'll go through all of these different concepts in as simple terms as possible. So the first thing that you have to understand is that FHIR is actually both a data standard as well as an API exchange mechanism, right? So this is actually the cause of most confusion, right? So if you look at the FHIR, the documentation, you see that there are multiple ways of like actually exchanging FHIR resources. But then you also have all of these resources defined here, right? So if you go to, for example, patient, they talk about what patient actually is, and then they define what a patient resource is supposed to look like. Now, coming back, FHIR essentially is a standard for healthcare interoperability, and they actually define both. They have a data definition, which we saw, and they also have different ways of exchanging this data, right? So if we come back and take a look at what the different kinds of exchange paradigms are, here again, they have this whole section on exchanging resources. The first and most common one is HTTP, right? So this is the HTTP RESTful API. Now, we'll try and understand this a little bit more in depth, right? So let's take a look at our whiteboard here again. So what HTTP means is that you have a client and you have a server, right? And the client and the server exchange information somehow, right? And if you are the client, in this case, you would probably be, this would be a laptop, or this would be a mobile device. It would be some device that's actually making a HTTP API call, and then a server is responding back with a response. Okay. Now, this is super simple. If you are developing on this side, right? If you're a client and you're developing on this side, you would probably be doing something like, you would be programming in JavaScript, or you would write Python, API call that would make a request and get this data from a FHIR server, right? So these are all, we've covered this extensively in other videos, but then you're basically creating resources, you're deleting resources, you're listing resources on another FHIR compliant server, right? And you're using HTTP to do this. Now, this as a client, you don't necessarily need to know what the server exactly does or how this server is responding with this FHIR data. You only need to know that, okay, you can make these API request calls, and usually these are all get, post, put, delete. There is also patch, but then I think nobody really implements patch properly. So there are all of these HTTP verbs, and using that you can access data on a FHIR server, right? And as a client, you're able to use all of these different client libraries that are available, and you can connect to a FHIR server in order to manipulate data in a FHIR server. You can also like access this data, right? So this is the most common way in which you would probably be interacting with a FHIR server. So you would be a client and you are interacting with a HTTP FHIR server, and you are getting or like creating data and so on, right? Now, what if you are the server, right? Like, what if you are the server? How do you implement FHIR if you are the backend? So let's talk about that. So if you are a server, right, you have a few techniques, right? So you're getting the HTTP request. You need to respond with something, right? So the client is again making this request. Now you can either, there are mainly like three options. So I'm going to talk about all three. So the first one is a facade. The second one is a synchronization, SYNC sync, and the third is hybrid, right? I'll go through all three techniques, right? Like how do you implement a FHIR server, right? So the first is you're getting a HTTP request. Let's say someone is making a GET call, right? For a particular patient. What you do is you actually don't have any data here in the FHIR layer. You have this in your database, right? Now this database can be, let's say it will be a SQL database, it can be a NoSQL database, it's completely up to you. But then your Facade here converts this HTTP request. It does some, operations here. It converts it from HTTP into SQL, right? And then from SQL, you're getting this data back, and then you're returning it back as a FHIR response. And again, this can be done for, it need not be SQL. It can be, for example, NoSQL. For example, let's say you're using Mongo. It can be anything, right? Like it doesn't really matter. But the idea here is that the Facade itself does not have any data. It has to talk to another data source, and this data source is the source of truth, right? The actual data is in here, and you're able to get this data back, and you're able to convert it, and you should create some type of a resource here, some type of a FHIR resource here, right? So now this is the Facade. Like I'll just erase this. So now what can you use to build this, right? Like how does someone build this? Now there are multiple libraries out there, but the most popular way to build a Facade today, if you're using open source, is probably the Java implementation library called HAPI. Now there is also a .NET library by FHIRly, but then it's paid, right? It's not free. There is one available in .NET as well. But actually, you can use other languages to do this as well. Like as long as you're able to handle this HTTP call, right? You're able to handle all of these get, post, put HTTP calls, and you're able to convert it into, like, let's say SQL or NoSQL, or who knows, like even your internal APIs, and you're able to return the FHIR data back in the proper FHIR format, then you have a valid Facade, right? So you don't have to worry. So this is how you do a Facade, right? This was the first technique that we talked about. Now, let's keep going. Let's talk about another technique, right? Like how do you do this a little bit easier, right? So in this, again, you have a database, right? So this is called the synchronization technique. Okay. Now, how do you sync data, right? So you have a database, and whenever there is some new data, like, your EHR is making a SQL request or something, you are able to stream all of this data in real time to another fully fledged FHIR server, right? So when I mean a FHIR server, this is like a fully implemented FHIR server. So this could be, again, you can use the open source HAPI, JPA FHIR server. You have multiple cloud offerings now. You have, like AWS has Health Lake. You have, GCP has its healthcare APIs. Azure has its own FHIR server. So what you are doing here essentially is you are taking a copy of this data and then putting that in a FHIR server, right? And then you have to serve read-only traffic from this though. Like I'll tell you why exactly this is the case. But when a client comes to you, right? When a client is asking for some data, you basically only support read operations. And this can mostly, it's like search, it is getting a particular resource and so on. So, but because this FHIR server has all of the search parameters implemented, this will actually be very simple for you. All you need to do is take a copy of your data in, let's say, in like SQL. There are really good tools that can do this almost in real time. Like take a look at change data capture and maybe things like Debezium. Debezium is like one hell of a, like an open source, really good open source project. And you put it into open source server like HAPI JPA or AWS Health Lake, GCP, Azure. There is MedPlum, there is Health Samurai. There's a lot of other open source and commercial offerings of FHIR server, right? And then you only serve read-only traffic, right? Like now this is super important. This has to be read-only, right? Now the reason this has to be read-only is because you do not want the client to write data back onto this FHIR server that you do not validate and have a copy of in your SQL database, right? So again, if you allow them, so do not offer post, do not offer put, do not offer delete, right? This is an anti-pattern. Like if you do this, then you will have data inconsistency. You will have data here that is not in the SQL server, right? And again, like you could kind of do subscriptions or something and then sync it back to the SQL server. But in practice, I've found this technique to be like really error prone, and it's not a good pattern, right? Like here, you need a source of truth, and in this case, the source of truth is your SQL server, right? It's not the FHIR server. It is just a copy or a cache of your SQL data in the FHIR format, and you're able to do reads. So, you can definitely offer get options and so on, but you cannot do post and puts and so on, right? So what is the third option? Again, the advantage here is that the previous method that we took a look at, which is the Facade, you have to write a lot of code here. Now, this is a lot of effort, right? Like this is quite expensive. You have to write a lot of code that translates all of these API calls into your data layer. And this is quite the task, right? And you need to think about indexes, you need to think about what SQL for this should look like and so on. In this case, you don't have to worry about any of that. You just take a copy of your SQL data, you convert it into the FHIR format, and obviously there will be a FHIR client here. So maybe, like in Python or JS or whatever. So there is a client library that then takes a copy of this and puts it in the FHIR server, right? Now, when you are using this technique, it needs to be idempotent. So we usually do a put request of these resources so that, even if this happens multiple times, so for example, put resource/ID. If you do this, then you're kind of safe. Even if there are multiple copies of the same data, then you don't create like multiple copies in your FHIR server. Usually, like when you're using change data capture, it's common to have multiple copies of what's happening in SQL. Okay, so let's come to the third option, right? So now the third option is actually just a combination of both of these. I call it the hybrid approach. And it actually takes the best of both worlds from both the sync as well as the Facade, right? So what we do is when you're writing data back, when you're writing data using FHIR, when a client writes, so for example, they're doing a put request or a post request or a delete, then you pass it through a Facade, right? You pass it through a Facade, and this way you're able to do all of your validation logic, you're able to do all of your business logic, and then you're able to store it in your SQL or like your source of truth data server, right? And then you synchronize all of this to a proper FHIR server, right? Now, this has two advantages, right? Like I'll tell you what. So this FHIR server can then serve read traffic, right? So now the advantages of this is that you only need to write the logic for the writes. So the Facade is like quite easy to maintain. So this is not that expensive. This is like okay. And this is also super simple, right? This is, you have a FHIR client that kind of copies, you're doing some sort of change data capture, and you're putting all of this data in a FHIR server. And then you're serving these read operations. Now, when a client looks at it from the outside, it does not need to know that this mechanism is even happening, right? Like for it looks like a normal FHIR server. Like, so when a client interacts with it, it just thinks that, okay, there is a FHIR API, there is a FHIR server, and I'm able to interact with the get, post, put, delete, and so on. But internally, what you do is you are actually doing writes through a FHIR Facade, and you are actually doing reads through a change data capture synchronized FHIR server, right? So this way you don't have to implement all of the search logic. You don't have to write indexes. You don't have to like write all the SQL for like hundreds of different search operations, right? So this is like the three ways in which you deal with FHIR in HTTP, right? Like HTTP is like the most commonly used way to interact with FHIR. Now we'll also take a look at the other operations, right? Like the other ones are documents and messaging is quite big. I'll just zoom in a little bit more. Now again, RESTful API is super simple. You just have HTTP requests. Now documents, I'll show you an example of what a document looks like, right? So what it is it's basically just a big, so there is this resource called composition. Let me just quickly search for it. Now, a composition resource can be used for both like documents as well as messaging. So what we do here is, if you take a look at this, you jam together all of the different resources that are necessary for, a particular, let's say an encounter, like, or a patient summary, right? Like you're taking all of the data and then putting it into one single big bundle, right? Like here in this case, you have a composition, but then this composition comes with a lot of other resources that it references. Now, if we come back to what this looks like, right? Like, so we've talked about a FHIR HTTP. In this case, it doesn't use HTTP, right? All of the data, so let's say there is a system A. It just takes all of the data that the system has, and then whenever it's like giving it to another system, it just gives out a document. Now this document happens to be in the FHIR format, but then you can't really think of it like it's not FHIR HTTP, right? This document is just going to another system, right? So you have system A, and then this is system B, and then it's just giving a FHIR document bundle, right? So the system B is then able to ingest this into its own system, and it's able to like understand, oh, okay, this patient had these conditions, or this has happened, right? But it's completely up to system B how it wants to interpret this FHIR document, right? You can think of it sort of like a PDF document, but then it just like it has a little bit more structure because the resources are in the FHIR format. Okay, so again, if you take a look at like how this looks like, the first thing here, if you take a look at the, let's see here, this is a consultation note. Usually there is a type in here. Let's see if we can look at a discharge summary example. If you see here, there is a type of document, right? And then inside the document, you have multiple entries. This is again like a bundle, and you have the first composition, and then you have different resources in here, right? All of this basically will go in here, and this will basically like be interpreted by other systems. Now, there is also the messaging paradigm, and again, messaging is super similar. In fact, let's see if there is I think there is no example here, but let me take you through messaging. So messaging is a system would probably have something to ask another system. So this is, for example, if you take Nafis, right? Like in Saudi Arabia, they do this where for insurance adjudication and for like insurance claims processing, they ask, okay, like is there pre-authorization, is it approved? Like, and the format they use here is a FHIR message, right? And a FHIR message again looks exactly like a FHIR document. It's just that it's not a one-time send and forget. It's you will also receive an acknowledgement to this particular message, and they'll again like keep going back and forth until a particular transaction is completed, right? So this is again like between two systems, you can transfer data through this, but then it usually happens in multiple steps. Now that is basically FHIR messaging, and this is again like this is documents. This is very common. You have, for example, this is CCDA used to be a document kind of a paradigm, but now we are also getting FHIR IPS, which is the International Patient Summary. In fact, I think I'll show you what the IPS looks like. So FHIR IPS. So it's one single bundle which will contain all of the necessary essential things for a particular patient. So for example, this is the IPS composition. It'll have the problems, it'll have the allergy intolerance, it'll have the medication, it'll have the immunization. All of this would go in one single document, and anyone who's kind of like working with this can immediately understand, okay, this is the summary for the patient. So this is the international patient summary, right? So yeah, I mean, we took a look at a lot of different ways in which you can interact with FHIR. We took a look at the paradigms. We took a look at the resources. Now, this might be a lot of different things, but then I'll leave a link to different resources down in the description below so that you can go in and explore these a little bit more in depth, right? Like we have videos and articles on many of these topics, and hopefully you're a little bit more aware of what the different ways in which FHIR is used are, right? And if you're interested in joining a free live webinar, we have this every month. A lot of people who are interested in health IT usually join. We have like doctors, techies, all of them live on the chat, and it would be great if you are also able to join us. I'll leave a link down below in the description. Again, this is just a free webinar that we conduct on FHIR, and we go into the details of like, okay, how FHIR is really being used in practice and how you can leverage FHIR to change the way you do things, right? So if that's interesting, just sign up. And thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.